PR's Top Pros Talk, Navigating the Corporate Affairs Landscape, featuring Jim O'Leary, Chief Executive Officer at Weber Shandwick, North America. And here's your host, Doug Simon.
Jim, what's the biggest challenge facing corporate leadership today?
Yeah, Doug, I think the biggest challenge right now, arguably, is that it's just more complex to be a leader than it's ever been. What that means more specifically, if you're a CEO, a board member, or a member of the C-suite, you have to do much of what, if not all of what you've always had to do. If you're a CEO in today's world, that would be managing inflation, recessionary pressures, and then, of course, all the things you're typically doing around capital allocation strategy and the rest. But now, in addition to that, you also got to navigate any number of issues, many of which, whether they're geopolitical, social, economic, are issues that in the past corporations may not have gotten as actively involved in as they do today.
Yeah, and sometimes there's no choice. Not doing anything isn't a win. Doing the wrong thing is a loss. So how do you navigate this complexity if you're a corporate leader? Obviously, you have tremendous experience in your amazing career in doing that. What are some tips you have for where do you start to navigate these complexities?
Yeah, I think what we have seen in the past probably 5 years, but maybe even more so, is that the role of corporate affairs, the corporate affairs leader, corporate affairs function, is more important than it's ever been, because that's the role and that's the person who's typically going to be helping a CEO alongside maybe a general counsel and a few others navigate all of the complexity that is new. And so what do I mean by that specifically? Well, if you look back, in the past 5 years, first you had COVID and all the complexity that had to be managed around, the safety and health of the workforce. Then you had the racial justice movement that really rose to prominence in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd. Then you had the social justice movement that is still, quite active, and you see everything that's happening to corporations like Target. Most recently last year was Disney. Then, of course, you have everything happening around sustainability and social impact, the pushback against ESG, pushback against woke capitalism. And then you have the geopolitical tensions, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine first. Most recently, what we're seeing this week in terms of the war in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Hamas. All of these things are things that chief corporate affairs officers and corporate affairs functions are helping CEOs and others leaders navigate and wrestle with. And this is interesting in a number of ways. Interesting, one, because this is an opportunity for these people and this function and all of us in corporate affairs to provide more value, particularly to the C-suite than perhaps ever before. It also creates additional challenges that we have to deal with on a day in and day out basis. And for many people, that can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I would say it's put more stress on the corporate communicator as their role has become more valuable, if not just invaluable.
That's exactly right. And you said it better than I'm going to, but I'll just repeat back what you said, but more valuable and invaluable, and also, frankly, a lot harder, right? I think it's arguably always been hard to be a chief communications officer, member of a communications team. I think it's harder today than it's ever been. And I think that difficulty is also why the value creation potential is greater than it's ever been.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen from our perspective is creating content for clients. The silos that used to be separate are all commingled. Internal comms has become external comms because that stuff's going to get out there. External comms goes back and affects internal. So for a communicator, are you finding it's best to sort of separate them out, lump them together? What do you feel is best practice? Or is it different depending on the specific company situation?
Every company's situation is different, and I feel like the siloing of yesteryear is insufficient to deal with the challenges of today. So I would not recommend siloing. I mean, obviously there needs to be a very thoughtful distribution of who's going to cover what, especially in a world where we're increasingly under greater pressure and stakeholders are expecting more from corporations and brands than they ever have, right? What's interesting right now is you look at the most recent data that we have here at Weber Shandwick, you still have roughly 2/3 of employees and consumers that are pushing for corporations and brands to, play an active role in either taking positions on or taking action related to social issues. At the same time, you have this pushback against much of this that we're all experiencing and seeing in the world with, like I mentioned before, the ESG movement, pushback against woke capitalism, and a number of related things.
Yeah, and the both sidism in the media will give those equal voices or disproportionate voices. It's not based on the number of people saying that. In addition to affecting what goes on within the corporation, there's also been more challenges for leaders on the agency side. What kind of guidance can you give for being an effective leader at an agency?
Whether you're a leader of a corporate affairs function or corporate communications function, or you're the leader of an agency, you certainly need to, in today's world, as we've talked about, with all the complexity, you need to be able to roll with it. You need to be empathetic with your workforce. You need to think about things from a much more multi-stakeholder perspective. I would also argue that you need to be incredibly agile, right? We've joked in the past that agility is the new stability.
Oh, that's a great line. And, given your role, obviously we've talked about what's led us to this point where we're at today, but what's the future of communications look like to you? Because things are changing so rapidly.
Yeah, I think right now there's three defining characteristics of the both what is the changes that are defining the future, and then where it's headed, right? Much of which we've already talked about. First is that the role of corporate affairs is more important. So we're seeing more corporate affairs leaders in higher positions. In fact, I think right now roughly 25% almost of the Fortune 100 have chief corporate affairs officers, significant increase from the past. This is driven by the fact that, there's a need to manage any number of issues on a nearly daily basis, issues that we've already talked about on, in this discussion. This week, it's, the conflict between Israel and Hamas. So there's any number of issues that need to be successfully navigated. Second is, digital technology, tools, AI, generative AI, and the disruption that is causing everywhere, but particularly in our industry. And so no conversation these days would be complete without a discussion around AI. I would argue that AI and digital tools and tech are actually allowing us as communications practitioners, corporate affairs practitioners, to do more sophisticated work than we've ever done before. I would also argue that there's much greater opportunity for automation than is currently being captured, that we're just scratching the surface on. And as evidence of that, I think there's some data from Sequoia that indicates, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but I will cite the stat anyway, roughly 80% of content is going to be AI generated in the next couple of years. I think it's written content. So I found that quite interesting. The other thing, I already mentioned this earlier too, but it's certainly a defining characteristic of the world we're in today, is there are much greater expectations from a wider group of stakeholders than there have ever been. And there's a lot of conflict at the intersection of that requires, near permanent navigation. And I think as a result of all of these things, you're seeing, as we talked about before, more pressure on corporate affairs and corp comms practitioners, because there's much more pressure on CEOs. And if you need any data that provides evidence related to that, I think you can look at the most recent topple rate data. Topple rate, the rate at which CEOs are losing their jobs. And I think if you look at the most recent set of topple rate data, you'll see that CEOs are losing their jobs, or being pushed out of their jobs, or are vacating their jobs at a rate that is higher than it's been in some time.
Given the way trends are going, do you think corporate communicators, CCOs, are going to soon start to become CEOs at companies, or will it still come from a different path?
I think it's more likely that CCOs will continue to evolve into chief corporate affairs officers. And the difference being that the chief corporate affairs officer is typically overseeing a combination of corporate communications or communications, sustainability, potentially social impact, as well as, public affairs and government relations. And I've increasingly seen these things combined under singular leaders who have a seat at the highest level in the C-suite, alongside the CEO, or, underneath the CEO, obviously, alongside the general counsel, the chief people officer, chief financial officer, and all of the rest.
Yeah, this has really been a great discussion. I appreciate your insights. Anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think right now, one of some of the most interesting things that we're seeing, as we've already talked about, right, the need to continually navigate tricky issues, the massive transformation that's being driven by, generative AI and any number of digital tools, tech, and data, as well as, the increased expectations that we continue to see from a wider variety of stakeholders. It leads us to the conclusion that the role of corporate affairs and corporate communications continues to be arguably more important than it's ever been. And so fundamentally, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. And I think that the difference between the people who see it as a challenge versus those who see it as an opportunity is ultimately going to be the difference between who is successful in our profession and who is not.
That's a really great way to leave it. And it's definitely been a great opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on again. Really appreciate it.